Welcome, everybody. We're continuing our study of Melachim Aleph. We're up to chapter 4, Perek Daled. Chapter 4 is a chapter we're going to read pretty quickly, only because it's really a list. It's a list of names of Shelomo's cabinet, the people who made up his advisors and his closest government officials. That's the first half of the chapter. And then the second half of the chapter is Shelomo dividing the country into different zones, which is a little different than their tribal affiliations, for the purposes of collecting taxes. We're going to talk about why this was significant, why the text teaches it to us, and what we can learn from it. So chapter 4, as far as the content, is not going to be so earth-shattering, but there are things that we have to pay attention to. The text of the Tanakh has very subtle ways of teaching us important things, shrouded in what seems to be irrelevant details. A lot of people, if you're not sensitive to the text, you read through this and go, all right, they give me a whole bunch of names, they give me a whole bunch of places, let's get to something more exciting. But if you look carefully and you analyze this properly, you could actually take out a lot of interesting ideas about Shelomo building his kingdom and what was important to him. Where did his priorities lie? So we'll read chapter 4 relatively quick, and we might even get into chapter 5 today as well. Chapter 4, like I said, the first section begins with a list of Shelomo's government officials, his cabinet. Pasuk Aleph opens, we're on page 798 in the Sachs Hebrew-English Tanakh. Vahi HaMelech Shelomo, Melech al Kol Israel. King Shelomo was now king over all Israel. After getting rid of his enemies, after solidifying his wisdom and his hold over the kingdom, he's unanimously accepted amongst the Jewish people as their authority. Pasuk Bet, stopped up here, I don't know why. Okay. Pasuk Bet, Ve'ele hasarim asher lo. These were his officials. Azariyahu ben Tzadok HaKohen. First guy mentioned on the list is a man by Azariyahu, who's the son of Tzadok, and he's the high priest. He's the Kohen. Pasuk Gimal, Elichoref va'achya bene Shisha soferim. Two men, Elichoref and Achya, the sons of Shisha, were scribes. Yehoshaphat ben Achilud HaMazkir. Yehoshaphat, the son of Achilud, was the Mazkir. In modern Hebrew, a Mazkeret or a Mazkira is anybody? Secretary, right? A Mazkir is somebody who was in charge of maybe recording the day-to-day, the biographer or autobiographer of the king, day-to-day happenings in the kingdom, the historian, the recorder, things that were going on. He was in charge of writing down what was happening inside of the government. Pasuk Dalid, Ubnayahu ben Yehoyada. Okay. Ubnayahu ben Yehoyada al Hatzava. Benayahu, the son of Yehoyada, was in charge of the army. He was the chief general. Tzadok ve'Evyatar Kohanim. And Tzadok and Evyatar were also Kohanim. This is, remember, we noted that despite Evyatar being banished by Shelomo, eventually when all of the enemies went away, he was brought back to take a position as a Kohen in Shelomo's cabinet. So we have two sets. We have, first was Azariyahu, the son of Tzadok, who's the Kohen, and now it's mentioning to us again that there were other Kohanim as well. Pasuk Hey, yes.
Now, we were tribes. Then we had Shaul, which was like a ragtag king, but then David tried to make some semblance of the kingdom. Like now we're like an institution. We have secretary, we have all like government, well, government. We have governance. It's like he sort of is professionalizing what it means to be.
Yeah, so Amy's bringing up a very good point, that things seem to be a lot more organized. There seems to be a much more clearly defined structure to the government and to the kingdom. And also let's think about, and this is something that I wanted to bring out, is look at how the text is listing to us these jobs. The list is not random. When the list is being presented to us, it's being presented to us in order of what? Importance and priority. It's basically, what is your national agenda? So in a moment, I sent everybody a picture of, if you remember, at the end of Shemuel Bet, we also had a listing of David's officials. I want to, in a moment, compare the two, and you'll see that the comparison will highlight a couple of very interesting differences between Shelomo's kingdom, where we're at now, and where we were in the time of David. No question, Amy's point is valid, that really it's not to Shaul and David's fault of their own, because this is really the first time in history where we have a kingdom that is founded on peace and tranquility. We're not fighting our enemies internally or externally. Shelomo has ushered in a golden age of calm and authority amongst the Jewish people. So now you have the ability to set up a strong government that has different priorities, that has a true national agenda. While you were still fighting enemies both internally and externally, you really didn't have a peace to be able to do that, right? There was a lot of unrest. And that's certainly something that is highlighted here when you look at the officials. Let's finish to the end and I'll show you the difference when you compare and contrast David's cabinet and Shlomo's cabinet, how they're presented in the text. We were in Pasuk Hey. Va'azariyahu ben Natan al ha-nitzavim. Azariyahu, the son of Natan, was in charge of the nitzavim. Nitzavim might mean prefects. Do you have a different word for there in your English? I have prefects, which basically are the tax collectors, commissioners. So Azariyahu was essentially the Secretary of Treasury, so to speak, right? And he was in charge of making sure that all of the tax collectors were collecting their respective percentages from their zones. We will see that collecting tax for the government is a very, very important part of Shelomo's kingdom. Why do you think that is? You can't run without money, and especially what very major project can't you do? Exactly, Lisa, right? You can't build the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash will have to be built on the backs, physically and metaphysically, of the Jewish people. Financially, physically, they will have to build the Beit HaMikdash. That project cannot be accomplished without collecting taxes, which is why collecting taxes is going to be a major issue in Shelomo's rule. So Azariyahu, he has a person who's in charge of all of the prefects, which means that there's other people there's a subcategory of people who are going to collect, which we're going to read about in the rest of the chapter. V'Zavud ben Natan, Kohen Re'eh HaMelech. A man by the name of Zavud ben Natan is also a priest, and he's a Re'eh HaMelech. Re'eh means a what? Friend or companion, like Ve'ahavta le're'acha kamocha, right? Ish el re'ehu. There is some kind of a companion to the king. What exactly this means is not 100% clear. Like, what is his job title? What is his responsibilities? Is not 100%. What does that mean, a valet? Could be a personal assistant. Could be a personal secretary assistant. It could be a personal advisor, a confidant. It could be somebody who's like a right-hand man, like a close friend to seek advice for. It could be any of these things or all of these things, potentially. It seems as though this was like an official but unofficial title for people who were close to the king, but didn't necessarily have a particular role. They were just kind of around. Continues the text in verse 6. Va'achishar al habayit. A man by the name of Achishar was in charge of the palace. Seems he might have been the caretaker, the lead butler or something like that. Va'adoniram ben Avda al hamas. And Adoniram, the son of Avda, was in charge of the mas. Mas usually means taxes. In this context, it means the labor, meaning the physical labor. That is to say that when eventually Shelomo will build the Beit HaMikdash, there has to be a secretary of labor, someone who's in charge of who's working when and what jobs and what are they doing and how are they rotating to ensure that infrastructure is getting built properly in the kingdom of Shelomo. The most important part of that infrastructure will be the Beit HaMikdash, but we'll see that Shelomo is going to have a number of very impressive infrastructure projects. His own palace is a big one, in addition to the Beit HaMikdash. He'll also build many very powerful fortresses for what is the largest army in Jewish history to this point. And so he has to build, army bases and housing and everything else for the soldiers. So there's and also Shelomo is going to build a very impressive port to have imports and exports coming from outside the country. So Shelomo is building the country of Israel into a major world power, into a massive juggernaut here, economically, financially, militarily, everything. It's all, and religiously, of course. Is there a specific currency that's unique to Israel? It seems right. It seems like it's still the standard gold, silver, resources, commodities. It doesn't seem like there's I mean, we always talk about things in terms of shekel, for example, but that's really more like a weight or a value, not so much like dollars and shekalim and euros and things like that. I don't think we're at that stage yet. Yeah. And the things that we're going to read about in terms of wealth for the country are things that they could trade and go back and export to other countries as well. Verse 7, Shlomo shenem asar nitzavim al kol Israel. Shelomo had 12 prefects governing all of Israel. Basically, their main job was taxes, but it's almost like he divided them into local governors. So you had obviously the king, but then Shelomo broke down the country into 12 regions and put local governance in those spots as well. And they collected and provided food for the king and his household. Each one of them had to provide 1 month's worth of food for the king and his family. So each governor was under pressure to make sure that he collected throughout the year or at certain parts of the year enough to send back tribute to Shelomo and his household to feed them for an entire month. And Shelomo seemed to have many people who ate at his table, foreign officials, people who did well by the king, and all of the governors and officials who were part of his cabinet. Good? So now what we're going to do after this is it's going to extend for us the names of these prefects and the regions that they govern. But before we do that, take a look at the picture if you have it. I WhatsApped it to you. There's a picture there with a little chart that lists for us the government officials for Shelomo, brought here in Melachim Aleph, chapter 4, Pesukim Bet Tevav, versus David in Shemuel Bet, chapter 20. You see that? You see the chart? So when you look at this chart, what stands out to you? What do you notice as far as comparing and contrasting the list of governing officials that is different? Okay, so first thing off the bat is for Shlomo, the Kohanim are much higher on the list. We actually have 2 separate mentions of Kohanim, and the Kohen is the first thing that's mentioned on Shlomo's list, versus what's the first thing mentioned on David's list? The army, right? The chief of staff. What could account for that difference? That seems pretty clear, right? David is always fighting, right? David's national agenda was first and foremost security and expansion of the borders, enemies abroad and within. So for David, his prime focus was on his military and making sure that his country was secure. Hence, the first and most important position in his cabinet is the chief of staff, is the army. For Shlomo, the chief of staff army official Benayahu ben Yehoiada is not mentioned till 4th on the list, right? That definitely says something about where the military general ranks as far as importance in Shelomo's kingdom, which makes sense. Additionally, you find that the first 3 jobs mentioned by Shelomo's kingdom is the priest, the scribe, and the secretary. What do all of those give us a feeling of? That what is Shelomo's priority? Definitely religion is at the forefront, for sure. What else? So scribes, like what do they do? Correspond with other nations, probably correspond within the country itself, new laws that are doing. Essentially, the priests, scribes, and secretary create a strong foundation of what the national agenda is. It's a civil agenda, right? It's not a military, foreign affairs-driven agenda. So it's almost like, imagine we were voting for president and we had David and Shelomo on these 2 different times. David's most pressing issue is foreign affairs, right? Security from the nation. That's what he has to deal with. That is not Shelomo's priority. Shelomo's priority is handling the civilian population. How does he strengthen life for the people, for his citizens who are living in the country? The borders are secure. They don't have any threats militarily. In fact, we're going to see that nations abroad are going to flock to Israel to see the grandeur of Shelomo's kingdom. They're going to present him with gifts. They're going to come to hear his wisdom. They're going to be in awe of Shelomo. Nobody wants to fight against Shelomo. Instead, Shelomo's agenda is a much more civilian-driven agenda, how to maximize life religiously and economically for his people. And that's where his focus is. Doesn't mean you don't have to have an army. It doesn't mean your army is still not treated well, but it's definitely not the number one thing that is necessary for Shelomo's kingdom. You could see where scribes and secretaries and priests, rank for David much lower on the list than they are for Shelomo. So these are just some things that we observe through the list of cabinet officials that tell us we're in a very different mindset in Shelomo's kingdom than we were with David. And one of the reasons why Shelomo can be successful, whereas other kings prior to him were not able to do some of the things that he did, is because of national security. When you're worried about national security, it's very hard to further the cause inside of your country economically or religiously, because you're always worried about threats. That's your focus. The minute you have national security, now you could start to better work for improving life for your citizens in all facets that you want. And that's what Shelomo has the benefit of being able to do. You look like you were laughing, Amy. Our own country? Oh, Israel today. Oh. Well, for sure. I mean, if you look at the modern state of Israel, because national security is such a big problem, and it makes it hard to better the lives and some of the domestic things that you're worried about, right? For sure. But what are you going to do? You can't further a country when people are under attack all the time. It's just not, it's not possible. That's one of the challenges. It's why nations do attack, because even if they're not successful in their attacks, they could at least disrupt life for the country enough to make it very unbearable for them, right? Because they just can't focus on thriving. They're so worried about just staying alive, they can't thrive and be successful. I mean, but to a degree, it makes Israel today in the modern way pretty amazing in the fact that there have so many national threats, and yet they're at the cutting edge of medicine and science and technology and everything else, despite all of those national security concerns that they have. It's pretty amazing, right? That speaks to the degree of divine providence that we're experiencing in the modern era. The unit of the army you get placed in. Right. What you experience in the army that eventually propels you towards so many other things. Right. How many innovations and advancements has Israel made in the area of warfare and weaponry and technology, that many of those things had to be developed for self-preservation, right? In other words, GPS and Waze, I don't know how much they were focused on the civilian implications of those things as much as they were worried about what that could provide for them militarily. And then once those capabilities became available to the civilian population, it took off, right? So to a degree, you almost thank the other nations of the world for constantly fighting us. It sounds weird to say that, but through that experience, we have no choice but to innovate and do these things. And then we discover so much. But yeah, it's interesting. It's not easy. Yeah. Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, the ministers of the provinces and then the tax ministers are a little lower on this thing. Eventually, that does rise to the most important thing. Exactly. It did start off like that. Yes, it's telling us that we have a positive start where Shelomo's most important agenda is the religious agenda. But in order to accomplish that religious agenda, there has to be a Beit HaMikdash that's going to be built, and it might be a little bit obsessive with the taxes and how that affects later on. Eventually, the taxes will be the big issue that splits the kingdom apart. So there is a bit of an ominous feel to that as well. Yeah, no question. The remainder of the chapter is really going to focus a lot on the taxes as well. So let's read that. Let's start in verse 8, Pasuk Chet. The next list is going to be a list of the prefects, the governors of the specific regions. Now, the fact that Shelomo broke down the country into 12 regions, is that surprising to us? Why is it not surprising to us? Because 12 seems to conjure up the number of the 12 tribes, right? But what will be surprising is if we're using the number 12, what would we expect? We would simply expect Shelomo to collect taxes and place one governor from each tribe on that tribe and call it a day. Very good. So I'm saying, but if Shelomo was, I'm just saying, I'm playing the other side of it, right? If Shelomo was just going to do a simple 12 breakdown, okay, you already have a precedent, a structure in place for that, the 12 tribes. Shelomo is not going to follow the 12 tribes. He's almost going to redesign the 12 zones of the country, and he's going to place governors, multiple governors on some tribes and no governors from other tribes. He's basically breaking away, even though he's using the same number 12, Shelomo is going to break away from the traditional breakdown of tribe by tribe. That might be strategic. I already see Amy is giving us a strategic reason why Shelomo would do that. Why? Right. So in other words, Shelomo is trying to break free of the classic tribalism that has plagued us in the past, where every tribe kind of goes off on their own. So by redrawing the lines of the 12 zones to incorporate multiple tribes in the same zone is Shelomo's way of saying, we're not going back to that tribalism that we once had. Maybe he's even trying, if we say something a bit radical, to get rid of the concept of tribes. Shelomo might actually be attempting to end the concept of tribes and simply have everybody unite under one kingdom and use these new zones as their way of defining themselves rather than their past tribal affiliations. We will see that if that was Shelomo's intention, it is not successful, but it could be what he was thinking about doing potentially. That's the hard thing. Is it a good idea to break up the traditional tribes? One might take issue with that claim that I just made by saying, how can Shelomo break down a structure that was already put in place from the Torah, that was already put in by Hashem? Who is Shelomo to undermine what Hashem does? And I would hear that pushback, right? I could definitely hear that, and maybe why you wouldn't want to accept that that's what Shelomo was trying to do. And definitely, if you did say that's what Shelomo was trying to do, it's probably why Shelomo wasn't successful at doing it, right? But I think it's a nice idea that Shelomo was trying to break free from tribalism and trying to focus on uniting the kingdom. If not now, when? Now's the easiest time to unite them during unprecedented success and thriving of the kingdom. Let's see if that comes through in what we read. Pasuk Chet. Ve'ele shemotam. These are the names of the 12 prefects. Ben-Hur behar Ephraim. A man by the name of Ben-Hur in the mountains of Ephraim. Ben-Deker b'Makatz u'b'Sha'albim u'Bet Shamesh. A man by the name of Ben-Deker in the places of Makatz, Sha'alvim, and Bet Shemesh. Ve'elon Bet Hanan. And in Elon Bet Hanan. These are the names of places. Ben Hesed, Pasuk Yod. Ben Hesed ba'arubot, lo socho v'chol eretz hefer. A man by the name of Ben Hesed. What an interesting name, right? The son of kindness, basically, is in a place called Arubot. He governs Socho and the land of Hefer. The lands of Hefer that are being described over here, some of these regions now are actually in the Transjordan. They're actually in the other side of the Jordan River, where traditionally Reuven and Gad were there. Notice also so far, all of the prefects don't have first names. They're all being referred to as the son of something. Ben-Hur, Ben-Deker, Ben-Chesed. Then we get to Pasuk Yud Aleph, 11. Ben-Avinadav, the son of Avinadav, called Nafat Dor. He was in charge of all Nafat Dor. Tafat bat Shelomo haitalo leisha. Shelomo's daughter Tafat became his wife. Interesting little throw-in that the prefects had such access to Shelomo and were looked at so highly by him that he actually gave his daughter to marry one of the prefects. Right. This might be more of a futuristic statement of what's happening later on. Yeah, perhaps. Yes. Time, they're giving us the information now ahead of time. Pasuk Yirbet, Ba'ana ben Ahilud, Ta'anach u'Megiddo. A person by the name of Ba'ana, son of Ahilud, was in charge of Ta'anach and Megiddo. Remember the name of the place, Megiddo. Megiddo is going to be an important location. It's close to the area of the Beit HaMikdash. It's close within the boundaries of Binyamin, I believe. And it's going to be a major station of an army base. And eventually, Shelomo is going to place part of his palace there as well. Okay, so just keep that place Megiddo in mind. V'chol Bet She'an asher etzel tzortana, and all of Bet She'an, which is beside a place called Zarathan, right? Tzortana, mitahat liYisrael, below Jezreel, mi Bet She'an ad Avel Mehola, from Bet She'an to Abel Mehola, ad me'ever leYokme'am, as far as the other side of Yokme'am. So really, you probably need more of an ancient map to kind of see where all of these zones are being redrawn. But a lot of this is right in the middle of the country, areas around Binyamin and Yehuda and other things as well. Ben Gever beramot Gilad, I'm in 13. Ben Gever, the son of the strong one in Ramot Gilad, lo Chavot Yair ben Menashe. Now we're back on the side of the Transjordan. He had a place called Havot Yair, which gets a lot of press in the Torah as well. It was a place conquered. That was the lands of Og and Sihon that were conquered by the Jews before they entered into Eretz Yisrael. Havot Yair ben Menashe asher ba-Gilad, which was part of the Gilad areas. Lo Hevel Argov asher ba-Bashan. He also governed the district of the Argov, which was in the Bashan. Shishim Arim Gedolot, 60 large towns, Choma Ubriach Nehoshet, with walls and bronze bars. They were very heavily fortified and protected from outside enemies. Pasuk Yudalid, Achinaav ben Ido Mahanaima. Achinadav and the son of Ido in Mahanaim. Mahanaim is an area, we know that well. That's where Yaakov Avinu saw the angels returning to him as he was entering back into the country before he was ready to fight against Esav. Stopped in a place called Mahanaim, so that's kind of on the boundary of Israel. Pasuk Tetvav, Achimaatz ben Naphtali, Gamhu lakach et Basemat bat Shelomo leisha. Another man by the name of Achimaatz took over the area of Naphtali, and he too, close to the king, married one of Shelomo's daughters named Basmat. Verse 16, Ba'ana ben Chushai be'asher u'be'alot. Ba'ana, the son of Chushai, ruled over Asher and Be'alot. Verse 17, Yehoshaphat ben Paruach be'Yisachar. Verse 18, Shim'i ben Elah be'Binyamin. So now we're starting to see certain whole tribal territories that are getting one prefect. So really, if you think about it, the lands of Menashe and Ephraim and a lot of the Transjordan, all of that got rezoned into multiple zones for different governors. What does that tell you? That means who's paying a lot more taxes than others? Those tribes, right? Because remember, what Shelomo is doing here is he's rezoning the country into 12 areas, right? And each of those areas are in charge of paying tax 1 month a year back to the government. So if we just did it based on tribes, so then each tribe would take 1 month and we'd call it a day. That's not what happened. The areas of Menashe and Ephraim are being rezoned into multiple zones, which means that the tribes of Menashe and Ephraim are in charge of paying multiple months of taxes, whereas other tribes are going to be meshed together and get off easily, where they only have to pay 1 month or even half a month's worth because they're going to get to pay with another tribe. They're going to split it with another tribe. So Shelomo's rezoning really does not favor the tribes of Menashe and Ephraim. Correct, but when you put it all together, right, based on the classic breakdown of Menashe and Ephraim, Menashe and Ephraim's territory, if we just chose it 1, 2, 3, 4, each tribe alone, Menashe would pay 1 month, Ephraim would pay another month. By rezoning them into 4 different zones, right, it means, yes, each citizen only pays 1 month, but in total, Menashe and Ephraim together are responsible for 4 months, if you group them together, for 4 months of taxes. Whereas Asher gets lumped, or Shimon gets lumped in with another tribe, only has to pay 1 month of taxes, and they get to shoulder the load together with another tribe, which means they get to pay maybe a half a month's worth of taxes. So the rezoning of the tribes over here, the rezoning of the country, actually hurts the tribes of Menashe and Ephraim. They will have, in total, they're going to have to pay more taxes than the other tribes. I'm saying from an individual person, yes, but when you're looking at it from a tribal perspective, they're going to pay more. But they can't help themselves. They can't help not looking at it that way, right? That's the point. They've been so ingrained, the tribal looks of them have been so ingrained that for Shelomo to uproot those, they're too deep-seated into the consciousness of the Jewish people. In the end of the day, the tribe of Ephraim and Menashe looked at themselves and said, we're paying a lot. When you look at our tribe in comparison with other tribes, we're going to be paying a lot of taxes that others are not. To a degree, you can make the argument that Shelomo did this intentionally to weaken the tribes of Menashe and Ephraim who come from Yosef. They're not just more wealthy, perhaps, they're also more powerful, right? The tribes of Menashe and Ephraim are typically the ones that contain a lot of the threats maybe to Shlomo. Eventually, when the kingdom splits, where will the first kingdom come from? It'll consistently come from Ephraim, right? I think Shelomo, it's possible, you can theorize that Shelomo saw the tribe of Ephraim as a potential break-off from him, and so to subvert them, he kind of put them underneath his rule. He took a iron fist to Menashe and Ephraim. A theory you could argue. It's a theory that there's geography. There's probably a lot of motivations that take into consideration. Yeah. I'll read to you from Rabbi Israel, right? He says, rezoning the country has its hazards. Notwithstanding Shelomo's intent, historic identities endure. Ethnic statuses remain intact. Shelomo's changes are more severe for the tribes of Ephraim and Menashe, as they suffer from a more invasive subdivision and hence a disproportionate tax burden. This uneven policy is possibly deliberate, intended to weaken the tribes of Yosef, who represent a potential source of opposition to the king, but this strategy has a devastating ripple effect in later years. Those will be the first tribes that break off from the rest of the kingdom when push comes to shove. The act that eventually tears Shelomo's kingdom apart after his death is a demand for a reduction of a crushing tax burden, and the epicenter of the revolt is the tribes of Joseph, right? So Shelomo may have intended one thing, but actually ended up fueling more fire to it eventually down the road, right? Let's continue on, and you'll see another interesting detail here. We're on verse 19. Gever ben Uri be'eretz Gilad, Eretz Sichon Melech HaEmori. Notice all of this is in the tribe of Menashe. Every time it's Gilad, it's always Menashe. Melech HaEmori ve'od Melech HaBashan unsiv echad asher ba'aretz, and one prefect who was in the land. Verse 20, Yehuda v'Yisrael rabim kechol asher al hayam larov. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sands of the sea. Ochlim v'shotim usmechim. They ate and they drank and were content. So the chapter ends on a very high note, right? Which is that all of Shelomo's new agenda and his institutions are bringing a tremendous amount of success. The Jewish people are thriving. And when they can eat and drink and provide for their families, and they're calm and there's no war, everyone's happy. No issues are coming up, right? You could see the state of mind of the people. While they're successful, they're happy, right? Taxes, sure, we'll pay it. We have a lot. We have surplus. Labor, no problem. We don't have any issues. However, this is sowing the seeds when eventually issues start to arise. These issues are now, and success isn't as clear to them. All of a sudden, there's going to start to be pushback. While everything's going well, nobody's got a problem with any of these things. That's another interesting issue. That was the next thing that I was about to bring up, which is if you look throughout the prefects and the zoning, we don't see anybody on the tribe of Yehuda, right? Which that's fascinating because Yehuda is perhaps the most numerous of all of the tribes. They've always been one of the most powerful tribes. They're probably amongst the most wealthy tribes. Yet, what have we always seen consistently? We've always seen Yehuda kind of be the favorites, right? They get special treatment, they get counted separately, they get looked at differently. And so there's always this little favoritism that goes to the tribe of Yehudah, which you could read over here. Is it possible that Shelomo taxed everybody in Israel besides his own tribe, Yehudah? It's a tough one, right? We don't see a prefect mentioned here, so maybe that's true. But if it is, that is a really, really bad look for Shelomo. We do not see anything about Yehudah. Later on, when they say that it was Yehudah, I'm sure, we saw it earlier. If you remember, go back to Shemuel Bet. When David came back to regain his melucha, right? Remember the first time David became king, he tried not to show favoritism to anybody. We made a very clear point about that. Then when he regained, then what did eventually he lose? He lost the support of his own tribe. His own tribe went after his son, Absalom. So when he came to regain the melucha, we saw that he played a card of favoritism towards Yehudah, which led people to say, "En lanu chelek," we don't have a part in the kingdom of David. Remember, they said that, which spurred another revolt, right? Who led that revolt? Do you remember? You got to go back to the book of Shemuel for that. It was towards the end chapters. It was in the chapter. I forget now. Right? It was in the chapters of like 21, I think it was. Right? When David is coming back to get the kingdom. Everyone starts with an aleph. I want to say it's in chapter 20, actually. Sheva ben Bichri. No. Sheva ben Bichri, right? Chapter 20, Sheva ben Bichri is the one who starts up another revolt. His revolt does not last very long. He tries to fortify in one spot. Yoav takes care of them. It doesn't really happen very well, but it sowed the seeds for the later rebellion of Yarovam, which is going to come at the end of Shelomo's kingdom. Where was it? Sheva ben Bichri. It's in Shemuel Bet, chapter 20. He realizes that David has favored the tribe of Yehudah. And what does he say? He says, Vayitka b'shofar, he blows the trumpets, Vayom, and he says, En nanu chelek b'David, we have no portion in David's kingdom. Velo nachala beven Yishai, we don't have an inheritance in Ben Yishai. Ish le'ohala v'Yisrael, every member of the Jews should go back to their tent, right? He was upset about the favoritism David was giving to the tribe of Yehudah, and he didn't like it. So I'm hard-pressed to say that Shelomo would then follow his father's suit and create such an egregious separation between Yehudah and the rest of the kingdom, and not charge them tax while charging heavy taxes on the rest of the nation. That just is so outlandish. It's so egregious that it would. I just can't see someone as wise as Shelomo doing that. Because we don't find, why are we saying he didn't charge Yehudah? We don't find the prefect that was in charge of the tribe of Yehudah. There's no territory that's divided there. It's possible that parts of Yehudah are included in some other tribal rezonings, right? Who? Oh. He's going to play an important part, that guy on the Mas, Adoniram ben Avda. But what does he have to do with Yehudah? Possibly. It could be that they have physical labor went out, but we don't see, as opposed to, we see Ephraim, we see Menashe, we see Sachar, we see Asher, we see Naphtali, we see Binyamin, then we see Ephraim and Menashe get divided heavily. We don't see anybody on Yehudah per se, right? And then it says in verse 20, Yehudah v'Yisrael Rabim. Exactly, right? So I'll read to you what Rabbi Israel brings. He says, a further significant and troubling detail is that the tribe of Judah is not specified in this list of tax colonies. Some suggest that this omission is evidence that Shlomo's own tribe is fully absolved of its tax burden. Da'at Mikra denies this favoritism on Shelomo's part, asserting that such blatant favoritism would surely have featured prominently as an argument in Yerovam's rebellion, which we don't see him mention that. Da'at Mikra therefore adopts an unconventional reading that merges verses 419 and 420 to read, and one prefect who was in the land of Yehuda. They actually take the word Yehuda from verse 20 and attach it to verse 19. And therefore it would read, the last part of verse 19 would read, Unsiv ehad asher ba'aretz Yehuda. And then the Yisrael Rabim kechol hayam. They actually are contending, this is where it gets a little tricky though. They're actually contending that the Sof Pasuk is like in the wrong place and should really be after the word Yehuda, that there was one prefect in Yehuda, and then the rest of the sentence should read, V'Yisrael Rabim kechol hayam. It's a nicer reading and it makes us feel comfortable, but tradition doesn't break it down that way. So maybe it's meant to be read that way because it's no nikudot, but there's, I don't know, an ominous tension here. I don't know. It's interesting. It's very interesting. I have to take a look and see if any of the commentaries mention this. Yeah. Rashi over here brings an interesting debate in the Gemara between Rav and Shmuel. They say, one of them says, Echad Memune al Kulam, that this Netziv Echad Asher Ba'aretz, going back to the top, Azariah ben Natan, who was in charge of everybody. That's reiterating that there was one prefect in charge of everybody. While another says is that what would happen, remember, he divided it into 12 zones because there's 12 months of the year, right? Well, what happens when there's a leap year? There's a 13th month, right? Then who was in charge? So he says that's what this Netziv Echad Asher Ba'aretz was, another prefect who was in charge of potentially giving and collecting a 13th month when there was a leap year for the Jewish people, right? So, I mean, there's a lot to probably say about this. There's some ominous undertones here, but ultimately, when you finish the chapter the way Pasuk Kaf reads, things are really looking up. Things are really successful. Ochlim v'shotim usmechim is not a positive in your book. It's a little too indulgent and physical for you. Yeah. No, it comes. The eat, drink, and be merry comes from a pasuk in Yeshaya. But yeah, interesting. Yeah. So again, I think you can potentially read, I think in a lot of these readings, we're seeing things that at face value are very positive. But there's some ominous tones that I guess are being seeded here that we could be worried about for the future, knowing, especially us knowing what the end is eventually going to be, right? So maybe you don't like ochlim v'shotim usmechim because it sounds too physical. It doesn't seem to be with the things that we as a nation focus on. But certainly when you read things like Ver Rabim kechol asher al hayam, there are plenty like the sands of the sea. What does that trigger for you? The promise to Avraham Avinu, right? We're seeing covenants that were made hundreds and thousands of years earlier starting to blossom and come to fruition, right? That can't be that's got to be positive, right? So certainly Shelomo is working his kingdom towards a very high point of thriving and success, the likes of which we have not yet seen and we've been waiting for quite some time. Yeah. Questions on chapter 4. Okay, so while we have a few more minutes, maybe we'll start chapter 5. We certainly won't read through the whole thing, but we'll get a little bit more about the success of Shelomo's kingdom. This next chapter, chapter 5, is going to begin discussing the strength of Shelomo's empire, all of the different facets in which Shelomo and his kingdom were successful, economically, militarily, religiously, etc., etc. So we'll start with Pasuk Aleph. Ushlomo haya moshel bechol hamamlachot min hanahar eretz Pelishtim ve'ad givul Mitzrayim. Shlomo's rule extended over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the lands of the Pelishtim. And that makes us feel really happy because who's been our arch enemy, the thorn in our side through the last several books? It's been the Pelishtim. And after David ridded us of the Pelishtim, we are no longer going to hear anything from them, right? Now we own their land, right? V'ad givul Mitzrayim, and all the way to the boundaries of Egypt. Magishim mincha ve'ovdim et Shelomo kol yemei hayav. They brought Shelomo tribute and were all subject to him all his life. Shelomo had no foreign enemies. He had no threats to the security of his kingdom. In fact, he had great public relations. All of the surrounding kingdoms paid tribute to him, brought him gifts, and showed tremendous honor to Shelomo and his kingdom. That is certainly a big change from the way things have gone until this point, right? By the way, the fact that Shelomo is thriving through the expansion of his boundaries might be another explanation as to why he rezoned, because never has the kingdom been as large as property-wise. The land, the boundaries of Israel have never been as large at this point in than any other point in history. So he couldn't just go based on the regular tribes because they expanded the boundaries so much. He needed to rezone everything. That could be another explanation. Verse 2. Vahi lechem Shelomo leyom ehad. Shelomo's daily provisions consisted of sheloshim kor solet, 30 kor of fine flour, v'shishim kor kemach, and 60 kor of ordinary flour. These are exorbitant quantities of food for one household. 3, asara bakar, 10 fattened oxen, biri'im, which were healthy, ve'esrim bakar re'i, and 20 pasture-fed oxen, ume'atzon, and 100 sheep and goats, levad me'ayal utzvi v'yahmur, besides for the deer and gazelles, ubarburim avusim, and the roebucks and fatted geese. So we're getting a very elaborate picture of indulgence. I don't want to use the word gluttony because that sounds like a negative, but richness that's going on, wealth, prosperity in the kingdom of Shlomo. This is what is on his table on a daily basis. This is what his people are eating, and we're not experiencing famine. Nobody's upset about it. Everybody's going through this type of surplus. Verse 4, Hihu rodeh bechol eved hanahar, for he controlled the whole region west of the Euphrates, mitifsach ve'ad azah, from Tifsach to Azah, bechol malche eved hanahar, for all of the kings who were west of the Euphrates, v'shalom hayalo mikol avarav misaviv, and he had peace on all his borders around the country of Israel. Correct?
But that's on the ocean.
On the Mediterranean side, yeah. Huh? But then it even expanded. The Euphrates is Nahar Perat is on the other side. So the boundaries are, talking about the width from one side to the other. It's basically the entire Fertile Crescent, right? This is what people, is like the Phoenicians and these people wanted to own their whole time. Yeah. It's no coincidence that the rabbis say Shelomo controlled the whole world, right? Basically, they compare Shlomo's reign to that of Achashverosh and other massive emperors who ruled over the entire world from one end to the other. Basically, the entire known world, all its resources, all its richness was all under Shlomo's auspices. That's how we're looking at it. Yeah. Verse 5, Vayeshev Yehuda v'Yisrael labetach. Yehuda and Israel, again, that slight separation, they dwelled labetach, with confidence and trust and security. Ish tahat gafno v'tahat te'enato. Each man under his grapevine and under his fig tree. Midan ve'ad be'er shava, from Dan all the way to be'er sheva, kol yemei Shelomo, all the days of Shelomo. This is the classic imagery of tranquility and security for the Jewish people. This is what every Navi speaks about striving for. This is the goal, to achieve security and tranquility for the Jewish people, where everybody's relaxed under their tree, everybody's secure financially and everything else in order to accomplish success. This is the paradigm of success. And Shelomo has achieved it, and it remains the entire duration of his kingdom. That's not to say that there aren't some unsettling things that happen towards the end that eventually break forth from that, but that's the experience that Shelomo has in the height of his kingdom. It's very, very, very fortunate. So unprecedented levels of economic success going on here during Shelomo's kingdom. The next part discusses Shelomo's army. And even though we said that Shelomo is not a military regime, nevertheless, he had a very impressive army that was at least there for show, right, and security. And as a result, he has to actually house this army and station them in different places, right? The army is already, again, some of the ominous tones, because we know, what does the Torah say about the king and his army? He's got to be careful, right? We don't want the king to get a big head over the fact that he's got a very powerful army. Then he takes his faith off of Hashem. So we say that he should not have a lot of chariots and a lot of horses, and he should not go to Egypt to purchase those horses. So we're conscious of the fact that we want the army to remain a less significant part of the kingdom, and yet it will be very significant for Shlomo. Remember that at the end of the book of Shemuel Bet, what gets David into trouble? He tries to take a census of the people, and a lot of that census focuses on his army, right? His military power, which leads to a magefa, one of the most devastating plagues in the history of the Jewish people. Verse 6, Vayhi l'Shlomo 40,000 urvot susim lemerkavo. Shlomo had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariotry, ushnem asar elef parashim, and 12,000 horsemen. There's more horses than people who can actually ride them, right? There's chariots, there's stalls of chariots, stalls for the horses of the chariots, right? This is crazy numbers, right, for a king. This is Paro times 10, okay, for Shlomo. Now, you could tell, by the way, people have to build these things, right? They don't come from anywhere. So Shlomo has to make infrastructure for them, build them, provide for them. He's got to have enough animal food to feed them. He's got to be able to have food to feed the soldiers. So this is where the taxes come into play, right? And that's what he says in the next pasuk, verse 7. All those prefects, each during his month, would furnish provisions for King Solomon, for Shlomo, and all those who were admitted to King Shlomo's table, ish chodsho lo ya'aderu davar. Each one for his month, they were not to fall short of anything, right? You could imagine being one of those prefects and the pressure that was upon you to ensure that you brought back to the king exactly what he needed. Verse 8, v'haseorim v'hateven lasusim v'larachesh. They would also each in turn deliver barley and straw for the horses. Yaviu el hamakom asher yesham ish kemishpato, and the swift steeds to the places where they were stationed. So the prefects were also in charge of collecting taxes to serve the army and the horses and the chariots, because these were all under government auspices, right? So you can see the burden that's starting to be layered on top of the success of the kingdom. With great success also comes the need to continue the success, and that pressure can sometimes get to the core of the people. Finally, the last part that we'll read. So we've seen tremendous economic success, also military success. The next discusses Shlomo's chokhmah, his wisdom. Verse 9, Vayiten Elohim chokhmah l'Shlomo utvuna harbe me'od. God gave tremendous wisdom to Shlomo and insight in great quantities. V'rohav lev, he had vast understanding, kahol asher al sefat hayam, as vast as the sands of the seashore. V'terev chokhmat Shlomo mechokhmat kol bnei kedem umikol chokhmat Mitzrayim. Shlomo's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the Kedemites, and that all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And we know that the Egyptians were at the forefront of technology and many things that involved in wisdom. Verse 11, Vayechkam mikol adam, he was more wise than all men. Me'etan ha'ezrahim, veheman, vechalkol, v'darda b'nei mahol. More so than Etan the Ezrahi and Heman and Chalkol and Darda, the sons of Machol. We don't exactly know who these people are, but apparently they were at the time the paradigm for wisdom. And Shlomo superseded all of them. His fame spread among all the surrounding nations. Verse 12, he composed 3,000 proverbs. Many of this finds their way into the book of Mishleh. Mishleh is a book that's written by Shlomo, 30 chapters of proverbs. It's only a small percentage, a microcosm of all of the proverbs that Shlomo became familiar with, right? Lehavdil, most people know Confucius says this, Confucius says that, he becomes like a paradigm of wisdom. Shlomo was the epitome of wisdom in his time. 33,000 mishalim. Vayhi shiro chamisha v'alef, and his songs numbered 1,005. Songs might help us to refer to Shir HaShirim, right? The song of all songs, which is again hinted to in that Shlomo's poetry and his singing and his wisdom and his philosophy spread throughout the world and impacted the entire globe, right? Vaydaber al ha'etzim, he discoursed about the trees. Some people say he discoursed with the trees, that he had the ability to understand or communicate on a different level with all living things. But the simple meaning is he discoursed about the trees. He was a botanist. Min ha'erez asher ba'Lebanon, about the cedar in the Lebanon, ve'ala ezov, and the hyssop, asher yotze bakir, which comes out of the wall. Vaydaber ala behema ve'ala of ve'ala remes ve'ala dagim. And he spoke about animals and birds and creeping things and fish. In other words, he was a zoologist, he was a botanist, he was a philosopher, he was a physicist. He knew all of the different areas of wisdom. Verse 14, Vayavo'u mikol ha'amim lishmoa el chokhmat Shlomo. People flocked from nations all over the world to come and hear the wisdom of Shlomo, hear him discourse and lecture about all these things. Me'et kol malchei ha'aretz, from all of the kingdoms of the land, all of the kings of the land. Asher sham'u et chokhmato, who heard his wisdom. So it's also the paradigm of wisdom, of knowledge, of advancement, of engineering, everything. Shlomo is driving the kingdom of Israel forward as the epicenter of the world, financially, militarily, wisdom, knowledge, technology, everything is at the heart of Israel. And this is a very beautiful image to have of the country of Israel, one that we hope one day will rise again, right? And that's what we strive to be able to achieve. But it comes with its challenges as well, and it will come with some of its pitfalls, which unfortunately we will see from this as well. So there's a lot more to say. I think we'll pause over here. We'll come back to chapter 5 and finish it up and move into chapter 6 to see how Shlomo furthers the success of his nation. One thing we're going to see interestingly about Shlomo is his wisdom allows him to recognize when other nations do something better than him. And as a result, he's going to bring in professionals from other countries who do things better to train and teach his own people. So it wasn't only about Shelomo's private wisdom for himself, but it was also about making his country and all of its members the paradigm for wisdom and technology and expertise and craftsmanship and everything else in the world. So he wanted to drive the wisdom of his whole people forward by training them in all these different chumot. We're going to see that even more. Stay tuned for that. Baruch Adonai Me'olam. Amen. Who did Shelomo?
Yeah.
So, it sounds a lot like Hashem is bestowing this on him and giving him the divine providence, but I don't think it doesn't come without a sense of work and study and passion on the part of Shelomo. And that's where you see when Shelomo eventually brings in other people to educate him on these issues and educate his people on these issues. He's not afraid to bring others in to learn from them and then eventually become the best at it. Take their information and become the best at it. That's the way you grow. Enjoy. Have a great day.